Well, good evening, everybody. And my name is Tony Cross, and I'll be chatting today to my good friend Douglas Kruger. So, Doug is a Hall of Fame professional speaker. He's also had about a dozen, we're going to talk about this, a dozen commercially published books. Two of them have been bestseller status in print. And that in South Africa is really impressive. Douglas, I think this is our third book launch, if I can remember. I know we did one pre-COVID, and then we did one during COVID when you spoke about virus proofing your business. So I'm really looking forward to it tonight. And something only a few people know, Douglas is a member of Mensa. I'm not even sure I understand what Mensa is, but Douglas...
It's an Afrikaans word, it just means people.
Okay, excellent, Mensa.
Yeah, you could say oaks, and it'd be just as good.
Brilliant. So it sounds like these are clever oaks. So what I will tell you, you're in good company. So yeah, good evening, Doug. Welcome to the book launch. Again, another one of your books is hitting the shelf.
Well, thank you so much, Tony, and what a great pleasure to be with you. And thank you once again for being a part of this. And you've had a promotion since the last time we chatted. The last time you were presenter or interviewer. This time I see you are discussant. And that's a lot fancier than an interviewer. So
well, it is.
Great pleasure to be with you again.
Thank you so much. And of course, today's book launch is brought to you by Exclusive Books. So a special thank you for Exclusive Books for setting everything up for us tonight. So Doug, this is book number 9, 10, 12, 13. Where are we at? How many books have you...
It sort of depends on how you measure it, Tony. It's a bit of an odd one. Here's the very quick version of the story. I had one book published with a previous commercial publisher. This is number 11 with Penguin. So that number 10 with Penguin, and then one commercially published book in the United States with a completely different publisher. So if my maths is serving me, that brings us up to 12 commercially published books.
That's fantastic. And then I've known you for many years. So when I first met you, you already had one book published, and then I was privileged to work on one book with you. So yeah. We published a book on leadership some time ago. So I guess if you add those in, and I know you've also started some of the fiction books. So exciting. Probably the next time we speak, you might be at 20. Who knows?
Fingers crossed on that one.
Yeah, and as many listeners know, Doug, you've written quite a few about money. So, the one, for example, is around your thinking and how your thinking keeps you poor. So is it fair to say this latest book is the same? Is it different? How is it different? So if we hold up your book, How to Grow Rich, is it built on what you've written before, or is this one slightly different?
Yeah, this one is actually completely unique. And the Is Your Thinking Keeping You Poor book was the first one I ever tackled. And everyone has that one idea that they wish someone had shared with them when they were, say, late teens, early 20s. And that book for me represented that idea. It was everything I wish someone had sat me down and told me just as I began working and building money and creating wealth and so forth. And this one is quite interesting. It's a different animal for several reasons. In a sense, it progresses on from the book published in the States last year, which was, I've got a pile of them next to me, which was this Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good. And this one is about all the sort of strange woke trends that we're seeing around the world and how they compare or fail to compare with basic reality or economics or morality or whatever the case might be. This one takes that thinking into the world of wealth and economics. And the first half of the book is really just debunking the atrocious ideas that are assumed to be real, the things that you hear sort of bouncing around in the media and in common narratives that are really doing a lot more harm than good to people's wealth prospects and sometimes to entire nations. So this was a bit of an odd one in the sense that it doesn't simply start with proactive wealth building principles the way the previous ones did. This one actually says, it seems like we need to clear the mindscape, clear some of the clutter out of the way before we can even get to that. And that assumption is based on stats out of places like the United States and in fact all around the world, where often the majority of the youth believe in Marxist socialist principles. Now, I look at that as someone who sort of studies and is deeply interested in how nations escape poverty and how individuals and families escape intergenerational cycles of poverty. And I'm flabbergasted by the idea that these notions still survive. These sort of what a gentleman named Gad Saad calls thought pathogens, and it seems to be incredibly hard to get rid of them. So yeah, no, this is a completely different animal. It is Wealth book number 4. In order, they were Is Your Thinking Keeping You Poor? Then Poverty Proof. Poverty Proof had a follow-up called Poverty Proof for Entrepreneurs, and then this one, How to Grow Rich, 50 Ways to Debunk Money Myths and Master Wealth. So yeah, in terms of the wealth literature, this is book number 4.
Okay, so Doug, you talk about this concept of thinking. So, neuroscience suggests that, if you want to change people's behavior, it starts with changing their thinking. So, I read your book and you use these interesting phrases in your book as it relates to our thinking initially, before moving on to the practical stuff. And you have a phrase in your book, it goes wrong, wronger, wrongest.
Yes.
What's that all about, and why does it appear throughout this book?
My second grade English teacher is going to divorce me, and Eunice is going to revoke my So what happened here is, and everyone has gone through this at school level. You sit in class and it's sort of maybe grade 3 or standard 1 level, and you're dealing with words like big, bigger, biggest, and the teacher will say things like high, and the whole class will chorus high, higher, highest. And then the teacher, of course, gets this demonic glint in her eye, and she says dead. And the whole class gleefully choruses, dead, deader, deadest. And then, of course, you've got that one clever clogs in the front who goes, nah, and the whole thing sort of descends into chaos. And I pick on that as a, shall we say, grammatically wrong, but logically correct way of looking at these problems, that there are ideas that are wrong, but there are also ideas that are wronger and wrongest. And really, that's the first half of the book. And by a quirk of fate, we happen to have 2 icons who represent these 2 different schools of thinking. The one that I would say is the correct approach to wealth, entrepreneurship, and to escaping poverty, and what we might call his counterpart on the other side of the ideological scale. And by a quirk of fate, both happen to have the name Thomas. And the first is Thomas Piketty, who likes to speak about the 1% and hoarding the wealth of the world. And on the other side of the scale is Dr. Thomas Sowell. Now, I make no bones about this one. I'm a Dr. Thomas Sowell fan, and a lot of the first part of the book is debunking Piketty and what I believe is the potentially quite great harm that type of ideology visits upon societies that are trying to escape poverty.
Sure. So you've got this scenario, the tale of 2 Thomases, so to speak. So the first half of your book is really centered around that, that central theme of these
2 ways, 2 worlds, 2 wars for your mind. That's how it's expressed. Yeah.
And it's almost the contrast. So you've got the one Thomas on the one hand and the other Thomas on the other hand.
Yes.
So Thomas Piketty versus Thomas Sowell. So they have a different view on wealth. So if you had to summarize it for us quickly, Doug, tell us about the opposing views of how to gather wealth or how to build
and Tony,
wealth
as you could imagine, we could spend days on this, but the quickest summary would be redistribution versus generation. The first one assumes that we're simply approaching a picnic and seeing unequal distribution in the world of wealth, and that represents a social wrong. And the only answer to that one is to redistribute. The other author says, well, hang on a second, how is wealth generated in the first place? And that's Dr. Thomas Sowell's take. Dr. Thomas Sowell grew up, and this is actually quite relevant to our conversation, because quite recently, a social justice warrior picked on him and said, well, that's very easy for an old white man to say. Thomas Sowell may be many things, but he is not a white man. He grew up in Harlem. And like myself, he's been fascinated for his entire life with what works and what doesn't. He himself started off as an avowed Marxist and sort of learned the error of his ways. And he says, there's not much that's interesting about poverty, in the sense that everything starts from zero. All nations, all families, all entrepreneurs start at a point where there was no wealth. Then the wealth had to be created, made, generated, and traded into existence. And his contention, and mine as well, is That's what we should be studying. How do you generate wealth? And can you teach people to do that rather than creating large-scale dependency on governments? And Thomas Piketty does some, I'm not the only person who's ever debunked Piketty. There are whole books dedicated to this. And the Wall Street Journal, and in fact, the former head of the Bank of London have had some very serious goes at him and said that his data, when you go into it, do not bear out his conclusions. I'll give you just one example of that. His entire philosophy is essentially that the wealthy of the world are hoarding the resources. And as a result of that, that keeps them perpetually atop society. And it means that no capital is available to anyone else. And there are several fallacies in just that one idea alone. For example, that the wealthiest of humanity make their capital available to entrepreneurs and to startups and to other businesses. And even in a scenario where people talk about hoarding wealth, as opposed to being, say, philanthropic or reinvesting it, if you even hoard your wealth in a bank, that is used for other startups and other things. And you see some very interesting things on social media, which is where this kind of thinking really comes out and becomes quite poignant. People will attack companies like Amazon. That one takes a great deal of flack. And they'll say, Amazon paid 0 in taxes. Well, hang on just a second. Do you know why they pay 0 in taxes? If the United States government had a problem with that, they would be in jail quicker than you could snap your fingers. The reason that they don't is because they reinvest their money, they create new startups, they put it into research and entrepreneurship, and all of these things are deemed so desirable to the community at large that the government incentivizes them to do these things. So there's this kind of social justice anger version of what wealth is. Then there's the sound economics underpinning how it actually works. And most people are not aware of these differences and how radically different the paths are that you get sent down if you believe in one of these things or the other. And that's what I go chasing after.
So in the book, you're definitely making the point that, if you're stuck in your thinking and your thinking has been handed down to you perhaps from your parents or your peers or your teachers, you actually can't make that next step towards wealth because your perception, your view, your thought, your thinking about wealth is difficult.
Yes.
It's actually blocking you from building wealth. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. And in fact, that was the cornerstone of the very first book on wealth, which was Is Your Thinking Keeping You Poor? And I talk about my own ancestry going back, many generations, way back to somewhere in Manchester. And one of my ancestors working in the sort of manor house that you would see in Downton Abbey. But now, Tony, as you can imagine, we were not the people living upstairs. go down where the scullery maids are. That was us. And the kind of advice that gets passed on from generation to generation based on that kind of reality tends to be things like, keep your head down, do what the boss asks, don't make a noise, and gratefully accept your sort of remittance at the end of the month. And that's good enough advice for someone at that level of economic development all that time ago. But we live in a very different world now. And the way in which we earn and the ways in which we generate wealth have changed so radically that a lot of the advice that was reasonably stable 100 years and more ago simply doesn't apply anymore. We live in a world now where it is entirely possible for a young person to make money on Instagram, start a YouTube channel, and ask questions like, can I earn my first car as a YouTube star? There are different ways of looking at wealth today. And in fact, building on from that one, this was a major theme in the first book, and I also touch on it from different angles in this one. I talk about the idea of divorcing the link between the hours you work and the amount of money that you earn. And I think my all-time favorite example of this one has to be, if you go and have a look at last year, perhaps the year before, Forbes' list of the wealthiest posthumous earners, which is a fancy way of saying the richest celebrity dead guys. You and I could probably easily guess who comes in at number 1 and number 2, and they tend to sort of leapfrog one another. And it's always Elvis and Michael Jackson. Now, who comes in at number 3? Most people don't know this one. This guy comes in ahead of 2 deceased members of the Beatles, and his name is Charles M. Schulz. This was his workday. Every day he'd get up and read his mail, make himself a cup of coffee, eat a donut, and sit down for 1 hour to draw the Peanuts comic strip. And what he did, of course, was he then syndicated it around the world. 10,000 newspapers buy it, and each one pays him a small amount of remittance. And then at the end of every year, they take all of these cartoons and they publish them in books around the world, and then all of that is merchandised. And he did that for 50 years. Wealthier than two members of the Beatles. He worked for 1 hour a day doing something that he loved and that brought joy to the world. I think that's how you do it.
Yeah, I mean, Doug, that's a brilliant example of leverage, which you talk about in the book. Find those points of leverage because, as you say, he works for 1 hour. Now, we could argue that, the rest of the day he's pondering and he's thinking about the next idea for, a couple of the cartoons that are coming up. So, it's probably fair to say he's working a bit more than 1 hour a day. But that's leverage because he produces one cartoon, but he sells it, 300, 400, 600 times.
Yes.
Exactly what you're saying. But your thinking wouldn't have allowed him to do that if he felt, he was taking the different route of one of these Thomases.
Yeah.
So which of the two Thomases, Doug, do you think most South Africans follow?
I have a horrifying suspicion that we are in the Thomas Piketty camp, at least from a political perspective. And now within the book, I look at thought processes on wealth at various different levels. I ask questions like, what does an ideal country look like? Then I ask questions like, if you are at entry level wealth and you're really trying to escape poverty, what are the most important things to be thinking about? Versus what happens when you are operating at much higher levels, and how do you then start thinking at scale, as you mentioned? Some of the research that I did for this book was frankly horrifying because I was watching the wrong thing happen even as I was doing the research. This book, I think possibly to a greater extent than the others, is very research intensive. And I hope that the end result is still a very readable book. I've tried to make it very accessible. But one that I happened to be reading at the time that I saw our nation make this mistake was a book by a gentleman named William Easterly. And his book was titled The Tyranny of Experts. Bit of a misleading title. It sounds like he's picking on all experts. He's picking on specifically the dynamic of consultants who help emerging nations to get out of poverty. Now, he spent several decades working in these commissions himself and comes to the depressing conclusion that most of his life's work did more harm than good. And he then takes the composite research from around the world, various nations and various decades, and he says almost everything that governments have ever tried to do to help people to escape poverty has done more harm than good. And if they had done nothing, it would have been better. The most dramatic example of this one has to be the Great Depression in the United States. The research now says that the government's involvement in trying to help there prolonged the Depression by another 7 years. And then research by both Thomas Sowell, and it was actually picked up by William Easterly as well, points out that in the United States, coming out of emancipation, coming out of the slavery years, if you track Black wealth in America, it was on a sharp incline, tracking with their expanding liberties and rights. Now, that part is important. We'll come back to that. Then in the 1960s, it stopped dead. It halted in its tracks. We ask ourselves, what happened then? And the answer is President Lyndon B. Johnson declared war on poverty, and he decimated the economic progress of Black America. And you see that theme bear out in large examples and in small ones all over the show. When government steps in and does something, effectively, they push the bus off a cliff. Now, at the same time, as I was going through all of this research and working my way through it, we were in the midst of sort of coronavirus crisis and lockdowns and so forth. And I watched our president say, the government is going to step up and lead the way to economic reform and recovery. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's exactly what we shouldn't do. Now, it begs the question, do you need a government? And the answer is yes. You need upholding of contracts. You need rule of law. You need human rights. And then you need freedom, which essentially means get the heck out of the way. And just to add one more example to that one, the most direct example of the scale going one way and then the other has to be the nation of New Zealand. They started off as something like the world's, I think, third or fourth most wealthy per capita nation in the developed world. Then their government stepped in and regulated the living daylights out of everything. And almost instantly, they dropped to the least wealthy of the world's developed nations. And they went on like this for quite some time until an economist stepped in by the name of Roger Douglas. They actually call it Rogernomics to this day. And essentially, he just gutted all of it. He just got rid of it, and they shot back up to one of the wealthiest per capita nations in the world. Now, that thing of human rights, Tony, is the big one there. And William Easterly points out that what goes wrong is you have consultants coming from nations like France with Marxist ideology, and they will consult to these sub-Saharan African nations and governments, and they'll say, don't worry about human rights and individual liberties. We'll skip that step. We'll just go for a strong, centrally planned government, and you can plan the economy. And they're confusing cause and effect. The wealth and the prosperity are the result of the human rights and the rule of law, not the other way around. Strong, centrally planned economies do not make people rich.
Okay, so Doug, we've got let's talk about the South African government for a second, without getting too far into politics. Our government has its hands full with corruption, investigations, and COVID, and the vaccination rollout, and so on. But let's talk money. So what could any government, South African government or any other governments out there, what could they do to improve things? What's their role in creating wealth or helping people create wealth? Or what's your view exactly in sort of...
Tony, I'm simply going to say this. Step number one, if you want trade from around the world, if you want faith from the business owners in your country, if you want to start things flowing again, arrest someone for corruption.
Wow.
That's step number one. And unless you do that, the nations who are looking at us and wanting to trade, wanting to invest, wanting to bring in their money, and the businessmen and business owners here who want to plan and do things simply will not. And it's the same dynamic that you had with the Great Depression. Every time the government steps in and does something, they create uncertainty in the playing field. They change the rules, they change the expectations. And what do the people with the money do? They pull back to wait and see. We've been pulling back and waiting and seeing for, I think, a decade now, and it's the most dangerous thing. However, the broader scale answer beyond, please, for heaven's sake, arrest someone for corruption, would be rule of law is incredibly important, but so is freedom. And there's this interesting interaction between the two. You can have total rule of law by cryogenically freezing people in place. Then you have no transgression of law, but you also have no life and no vitality. Or you can go the other way. You can have all life and all vitality, but no law. Then you end up with piracy and gangs and anarchy, and that is also not a formula for wealth. You need the two together. Now, we're falling short on both counts. In terms of the Freedom to Do Business Index, we keep on dropping in the rankings each year. In other words, it's getting harder and harder. And that is by design from government side. We talk about entrepreneurship, we talk about the importance of small businesses, but every year we make it legally more difficult to be an entrepreneur. That has to go. It has to be scrapped. When you compare us to a similar emerging nation, any of the BRICS nations, and take India as a great example, India coming out of British rule had what they call the Raj laws, which were actually even stricter than British rule. And for a very long time, it was all about making sure that every small business owner complied with every single made-up bureaucracy and made-up rule that the government could dream up. Then they started getting rid of them. And you can track the economic progress in line with the dismantling of the silly bureaucracy. One of the titles of my book is "They're Your Rules, Break Them." And I use India as a great example of the prosperity that followed. So you need rule of law, but you can't kill people with it. And in this new one, I point out, the stats on business failures are depressing to begin with. Then you step in and you add government regulation to that, and half of what a new business earns goes on tax anyway. So it becomes a situation where like one business out of every 10 that tries to make it actually gets free. Then Thomas Piketty steps up and goes, wealth and privilege, we need to confiscate it. How do you compete with that? And how do you ensure that people who are trying to escape poverty get to keep their wealth and uplift their children when that is the thinking?
Sure. So if I had to summarize, I think what you said there, Doug, is first of all, corruption, let's arrest someone. And it doesn't have to be a government minister or someone in government. It could be someone in corporate, preferably both.
Yeah.
If someone's doing corrupt activity, let's arrest them both.
Yes. So that South Africa
or
believes there is such a thing as rule of law. Yeah.
Quite right. And then it's the balance, as you said. You can't have the anarchy on the one side, but you can't have this, overly controlled environment on the other.
Yes.
And as a small business owner myself, it's difficult. It's hard enough to make it, in an environment that really supports entrepreneurs and small business and medium-sized businesses. We recently we heard that the tax on a business profits will move from 28 to 27%. Well,
when the stats say most businesses fail, and the legalities say, and we're going to increase the burden on you.
Yeah, so I look at it and I say, well, it's a move in the right direction, but it's a very small move. But I mean, I'm hearing what you're saying. Let's get government to create the right environment, and then let's all of us as business owners be supporting each other. And again, let's do that so that we can create wealth. Doug, I love the fact that you use characters in all your books, and in this book is no different. It makes the reading really interesting. So you talk about Robin Hood, and you talk about starving artists. They make these cameo appearances. What do they have to do, with wealth? I mean, surely you can't go around stealing things like Robin Hood. What's up with that, Doug?
So the first half of the book, as we've covered, really is about debunking dreadful ideas around wealth. And as part of this sort of emerging narrative, and it's becoming quite aggressive, of hate the rich, which is very much Thomas Piketty's fare. And it's the kind of result that comes from what he teaches. You see various sort of icons being used as heroes of the cause. And I think, Shane, one of the ones that really didn't deserve it is Robin Hood. Anywhere in the world, say the phrase, he robbed from the and gave to the, and people will fill in rich and poor. And it is the exact opposite of what he did. In fact, the first question is, did Robin Hood really exist? And it seems like medieval scholars, at the very least, very much believed in him and wrote about him as a real character. But of course, what he actually did was he took taxes from a usurping tyrant and gave the taxes back to the people. So he was sort of a glorious, if informal, rebate mechanism. What he certainly did not do is steal from the rich and give to the poor. And what it does is it sort of ennobles this idea of taking from the rich because they're obviously evil. And it's that kind of narrative that we get into in the book. And you mentioned the second one there, Tony. It was Robin Hood, and the other one was?
And the starving artists.
Oh, yes, the starving artist one. Okay, so that's a bit of a departure from debunking Marxist ideas. And it's just debunking an idea that we all believe in and nobody knows why. And it's actually quite a fun part of the book. It turns out that the starving artist myth comes from one man. And it was actually written as a sort of a series of novels about Paris, I think about 100, 150 years ago. And this was the creation of this idea of the noble starving artist in a garret. And these days we talk about a starving artist, but consider, we don't talk about a starving new business owner or entrepreneur. There are every bit as many. There is no guarantee that a new business will work out in the same way that there is no guarantee that an artist will become rich. But when you go into it, it turns out that a lot of our belief system around art and wealth is flat out wrong. Very recently, a scholar in Italy found the old bank records and journals of Leonardo da Vinci. I mean, of all the strange things to unearth. And it turned out that despite his protestations to the contrary, Mr. da Vinci was a very, very wealthy man, even in his own lifetime. He wrote and spoke a great deal about how hard done by he was and how he was a starving artist. It was pure mythology. It was a flat out lie. It turns out, and if the numbers sort of, if I remember them correctly, that in today's money, he had the equivalent of something like $320 million available to him in liquid money and assets. So this idea of the starving artist is a mythology, and it is entirely possible to become wealthy with your art, the thing that lights you up. The trick to this one, of course, is you have to think about it like a business. And I think we are at our most idealistic and our most artistically creative when we're very young. I think what unfortunately does not happen is that a person will step in and say, you've got potential. Now let's talk about the business side of actually monetizing this thing. And I think that's where it goes wrong in the modern world. It almost becomes, that's a lovely hobby, but now get a real job. It doesn't have to go that way, but you do have to learn the business principles that monetize that turn that into a viable thing. And to sort of explore that very briefly, the way that I like to look at it is I always think of multiple income streams, and I like to picture the artist, the content creator, the expert in the center of a spider diagram. So you imagine your creator in the center, and radiating out from that are the various ways in which you express what you do. It might be books, it might be YouTube channel, it might be articles, it might be live presentations, and so on and so forth. One of the things that COVID has certainly cemented in the minds of wealth generators is that one or two is not enough. I mean, take my own scenario. I try to do what I do on several platforms. The primary one was speaking at events. I haven't done that in a year now. So thank goodness for things like the YouTube channels and the books and so forth, because were it not for that, I'd have been in serious trouble. And that's a wealth principle that we learned this year or last year.
Yeah, Doug, I have a friend, Bulelani, and he did something similar. He ran a catering business, mainly around, big events and so on. And he would cater for them both in the corporate sector and the private sector around funerals and so on. And then COVID happened, and he had to pivot, as you speak about in your previous book, had to pivot, and he was delivering eggs because he had access to eggs, and he had access to a vehicle, and he was delivering.
That's very clever. The way that he's looked at it, he said, what resources do I have at my disposal that I can go in a different direction right now? And that's one of the ways in which to pivot, but very, very clever.
Correct.
Yeah.
And in my experience, Doug, we can easily, blame our circumstances. We didn't have the right resources. We struggled to get access to capital.
Yeah.
I didn't go to the right schools. I don't have the network, and many, many other things.
Yeah.
Now they all play a role. We get that. But are these just excuses?
Tony, it's a very interesting one, because in the world of wealth creation, even the valid reasons why not become self-fulfilling prophecies. So, we can actually distinguish between the emotional, psychological side of things or the economic wealth building side of things. And it is very easy to get stuck on the psychological side of things and say, but look what is mounted up against me. And you're right. If you've grown up in South Africa with our high poverty rates and so forth, any argument for how hard it is true. Can't argue with that and won't. But unless you then decide that that's the emotional argument, but it's not helping me economically, that actually paralyzes you and keeps you in place. So the reaction to that is almost, you're right. However, and you can do that at differing levels all around the world based on what people have gone through. And again, it's not to in any way belittle what people have gone through. But then the real question that Thomas Sowell asks is, how do you move from 0 to 1? It's not interesting to study our own poverty or hardship. And there's no useful outcome to that. The useful outcome comes from asking, how do you go from 0 to 1? How do you actually start to generate something? How do you build that wealth in the first instance? And there are answers at different levels to this one. And at the most basic level, a group called the Brookings Institute asks the question globally: what are the two things that make the biggest difference in terms of either staying at 0 or going downward and becoming more poverty-stricken, or starting to go upward? And they identify two things that are completely politically incorrect, however economically true. They say the first one is whether or not you have children young and out of wedlock. Now, again, not moralizing here, and it's not to say that this is an economic death sentence for a person who has had children young and out of wedlock. But that is one of the things that most certainly determines the the stagnation financially of large groups of people. So given the choice, you do not want to get yourself into that scenario. And the second thing is simple work ethic. So the advice that comes out of the Brookings Institute is if you can wait to get married before you have children, if you can have a stable family structure and you have a good work ethic, that is almost certainly going to put you onto an upward trajectory rather than staying stable or going on a downward trajectory. Now, you can imagine the kind of feedback and flack they get for sharing that information. However, I would say that in a straight choice between hurting feelings or giving people truthful answers, we should always err on the side of truth. That's just the way that I'm built, and that's the way that I try to write. I would rather have someone give me hurtful insight into something that I can actually improve upon than stay where I am and wonder why. Now, when we get to higher level wealth building, those answers no longer apply, which is to say, if you want to become a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk, it's not about familying harder than anyone else. And certainly work ethic is a big deal, but that's where it starts to get into leverage principles. So there are different types of thinking at different levels of wealth building, and it's important to be aware of that.
Sure, but again, it comes back to choose the thinking that's going to serve you.
It's always about the thinking, Tony, and we can never get away from that. Yeah. And you can find yourself in a scenario where your parents have been wealthy and you then simply inherit it. You have the good house, you have the money in your account and so forth. And then we come onto that little interesting dynamic of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Because if what your parents are transmitting is only money, it's very unlikely that your family is going to stay wealthy for more than 2 or 3 generations. Turns out it's the values that are more important.
Sure. So as you say, let's not just give handouts, to our children.
Sometimes that's the worst thing that you can possibly do. Correct, and I actually break this one down in the book where I ask the question, how do you solve that problem? Because for a great many people who read this kind of book, you are clearly the kind of person who is searching for answers, who is interested in the education, who has the drive, the commitment, and so forth. What happens to your children? What happens to the next generation? You get it right, and all of a sudden you have these kids who are going, why should I bother? Life has always been easy. And there's an amazing amount of research on this topic. But the very simple version of this is if you transmit only money, you're essentially dooming the next generations because the bottom will fall out. But if you're transmitting values, then you're doing something vastly different. You are actually helping your family to escape intergenerational cycles of poverty. And there are very simple ways in which you can do this if you are already wealthy and you're worried about your kids. The first one is don't give them everything they ask for. They've got to work. They've got to have a little struggle, a little feedback from the universe. There's that book, Anti-Fragile, that points out that we are system adaptive, stress adaptive entities. If we don't have a little pressure and a little stress, we don't grow, we atrophy. And you can then do simple things like putting your children in charge of a charity, which means that they then have to run the business meetings, they have to manage the money, and they will learn some very important lessons about how this is done and how it goes wrong. So simple little things like that you can institute for the next generation and must do if you don't want to hand them finances that are effectively a curse.
Sure. Okay, to the listeners out there, if you have a question for Douglas, you're welcome to post it in the Zoom chat. We'll pick up a couple and as many as we can. Doug, let's talk about the second part of the book. So the practical stuff, the actions part of this book. First of all, what type of person does become wealthy, Doug? Okay. Are there common traits?
Yeah. Yes, and this is some interesting territory. So again, part of the research for this one, I compared composite lists of the research done into the type of person who becomes rich. And there are very definitely strong similarities between all of the research that agree on who effectively makes it and who doesn't. And I think there's actually a lot of hope to be found here in the sense that you do not have to be a brash, pushy salesperson. I'll give you one example. One of the qualities, for example, is the amount of push that you have. And that summarizes various insights by different people who have studied this and sort of tracked people who become self-made, first-generation millionaires and billionaires. And the word push comes up over and over again. Now, at first glance, we might be horrified by that and say, well, again, I'm not Donald Trump. I'm not that kind of personality. However, it turns out that it works just as well in the artistic world. So take someone like Ed Sheeran. Ed Sheeran, wealthy enough now to buy several private islands and kind of dish them out among his friends. But he's also very much of a bloke next door, quiet, quite sort of reserved personality. However, when it comes to his art, there has been non-stop push all his life. There are videos of him busking in London train stations at the age of like 12, 13. And you watch these videos of him out there playing, out there at pubs, out there busking, out there at a concert, and it grows and grows and grows and grows. What he didn't do was sit at home and wait to be discovered. So it's not about fundamentally changing your personality. It's about the amount of drive you have in the thing that you do and with the thing that you love. But that word push, we can't escape that one. Now, here's one that comes perhaps a little closer to Donald Trump territory, is that these people don't care about feedback. And that's quite an interesting one. Most of humanity is quite neurotic about what other people think. In the world of professional speaking, there's a joke that does the rounds based on a very human truth, that whenever they ask people, what is your number one fear in the universe, death comes second and public speaking comes first. And of course, what that teaches us is that at your average funeral, most people would rather be the guy in the box than the one doing the eulogy. But there's something in that tells us a lot about human psychology. It's not the speaking per se, it's the judgment of others. It's standing in front of a crowd where you are singled out and they are looking at you and you are delivering your thoughts in your voice and they are looking at your physicality and everyone is effectively judging you. Most of us are horrified by that idea. It turns out that the rich are, while they're interested in feedback from an almost evaluative perspective, they want to know what works and what doesn't. They don't really seem to care what you think of them. And that's quite a hard one for most of us to master. But it turns out that is almost always the case. They are on a mission. They want to do their thing. If there's feedback from you, that's interesting, but they don't particularly care emotionally. And that just sort of hints at the kind of psyche and makeup of the sort of person who drives their thing through to success. And again, most of it is about that drive and about that push. You have to have gargantuan amounts of it to make it work.
Sure, Doug. As you were talking, I was watching your likes that were just disappearing. I was like shocked.
Oh,
you know,
that's
your likes was disappearing.
The lights went out. The bouncer's gone from his bungee.
Yeah, so I guess that's the social dilemma, and you know, maybe a quick message for let's call it the younger people, the younger readers of your book, and the younger readers listening in now. The reality is that you can pull from the feedback on a intellectual basis, so you can improve your craft, etc.
Yes.
So what I'm picking up you saying is when you let it impact you emotionally, you're gonna battle and you're gonna be knocked down so many times.
Yes,
through the
and a good phrasing of that, Tony, is the word neurotic. The wealthy are not neurotic; they are extremely mentally stable. Now, let's just understand that's not the same thing as saying that they are necessarily right about everything. It just means that they're very sure of themselves and they are not neurotic about what other people think. And that, I think, is the key differentiator. And again, it doesn't mean that you have to be the sort of hard driving, cigar chomping, stereotype of a sort of a bully. It can mean that if you want to make it as a comedian, that you're very interested in feedback from audiences, but you're not that hung up on events that don't work. If it's a flop, you go, that's interesting. Why? And you keep pushing. That's the part that matters. That's the dynamic that we're after. Now, in terms of how you then activate that becomes quite fascinating, where the psychology, the kind of the road here, the rubber hits the road. The most basic and almost it's a principle that is so simple that most people overlook it. The most basic principle of wealth building is that wealth equals a little left over. And unless there's a little left over, you are not building wealth. Now, again, so deceptively simple that we almost fool ourselves into thinking that this one doesn't matter. If you are earning a very small amount from a very entry-level job or even selling oranges, but you have a little left over, you are getting richer. If you're earning R1 million a year and you're spending 1.2 million a year, you are not getting richer. You are in fact getting poorer. What you've done is you've bought yourself liabilities, and you are funding your right to get poorer day by day. And as I say, it's such a simple principle that we miss it. But all wealth generation is about a little left over. And that becomes almost like a sort of a pop quiz. And it's something we can actually ask our viewers right now. You don't have to do this on any sort of grand scale. Don't bother doing a massive audit. Ask yourself the basic question: is there more coming in than going out, or do you suspect there's more going out than coming in? And Robert Kiyosaki was perhaps the first to point out in Rich Dad Poor Dad, that is the formula for wealth. If it's going one way, good. If it's going the other way, you're in trouble and you need to change that dynamic. Then, of course, it's about scaling it. But unless you get on the right side of that equation, there's no other discussion to be had. That's the starting point.
And yet, Douglas, in my experience, many people don't have a budget. Many business owners, as strange as that may sound, don't have a budget. They don't have a process of tracking their in and out, as you call it.
Yeah.
So that's the one side to talk about. The other one is, should you ever get a job? Should you just start your business? What's your advice? And either way, you need a budget.
Yes.
But what's your view on that? Getting a job working for someone else?
Yeah. Well, tell you what, Tony. Let's jump back to the budget one for just a second there. One of the sort of quick fixes to that one is to have someone doing your accounting for you. But research suggests that 1 in 3 failed businesses fails because the accountant steals from the business. So just chuck that out there. It's not always that high, but in certain places and certain times and scenarios, the research says that 1 in 3 failed businesses failed because someone on the inside stole from the company. And this is not casual pilfering. This is someone with access to your books. And what that suggests to us is actually quite interesting. It suggests that nobody sees it coming. That the people, the men and women who turn out to be con men, who actually steal from you, are the nicest people you will ever meet. They generally, and here's something very interesting, they generally get away with it more than once. And I mean, that's baffling. But when you dig down into that research, what actually happens is when they're caught out, they have a grand sob story about this went wrong with the family and I just thought I'd borrow for a while. And then they do it a second time, almost without fail. So it's a hard lesson to learn, this one. But we need to know in advance that the people that we do trust with our accounts quite regularly are not actually dependable, and we have to safeguard against that. And it's horrible to have to say that, but it happens so often that it's one of the major reasons that businesses fail. And onto your next question there, you were asking, should you ever be employed? And that's a fascinating question, because if you're reading books on wealth and you're young, starting out, and asking the question, should I build my own business or should I ever be employed? Is there ever any upside to it? My advice looking back on this one is I say that you should ultimately own your own business, your own, what I call a money generating machine. And that's not necessarily the same thing as being the boss of a business. And we'll circle back to that one. But this is almost like the US, never mind, we'll get sidetracked. The idea is you should, in fact, be employed early on, but only as reconnaissance. So in other words, should you seek out employment? Yes, but do it with the goal of learning. That means that you are not necessarily going after the highest salary. You're going after the best learning opportunity. And that is a very different way of looking at it. This is an extraordinarily different way of looking at it, because most young people will go for the thing that they can get that gives them the most money now. In some ways, that can end up being a financial trap, because it allows you to buy the phone, the first car, to get the house, the whole thing. And then you get that momentum going that you then have to fund ever after. And you might not be able to escape that beyond a certain level of momentum. If you're doing this cleverly and strategically, what you want to do is go and find out how a business like that generates money. What are the issues? What are the problems? How do you service a customer? How does it lead to a point of sale, and so forth? What goes right? What goes wrong? And how can you use that understanding to then start your own business? And that's a tough call, but that is what I would recommend. Use it as reconnaissance.
And then, as you were saying earlier, Doug, if there's something left over, that means you're building wealth. So if you're being employed, as you mentioned
Yeah.
earlier, and there's something left over and you're saving it, you're investing it, you're doing
Yeah.
something with that money, putting it towards a business, whatever it may be, you're building wealth. And if that
So
continues.
linking back to what you asked there about the characteristics and the traits of the rich, here's another surprising one. They are unbelievably frugal. And even at the level of the multimillionaires living in massive mansions, when you start investigating what's going on behind the scenes, the ones who do not lose their mansions after 2 years and falling behind in payments, the ones who keep this up for decades, are living way below their means. And it's always deceptive, because you might see the Mercedes and think, wow, one day, the second I can afford a Merc, I'm going after one. The second I can afford the BM, I will. The person who is able to stay at that level for a long time could easily afford double, triple, or quadruple that. That is a very conservative purchase for them. And I think this is perhaps one of the ones that plagues young people the most. And it certainly happened to me. I mean, not even pretending. The second I could get the expensive car, the one with the ST on the back, I was out there blowing more money than I had. Lessons learned the hard way, and wisdom over the years. But what you actually want to do is to look at something like the latest phone, the sneakers, the car, the house, as something that you get if you can afford double that. And until you can, don't do it. Be wise. Build up the money in the background. But unfortunately, most young people learn this lesson the hard way.
Sure, I can remember, Doug, you driving around in an orange car of all things. I do remember that quite a few years ago.
165 kilowatts of raw freedom.
Doug, let's talk about you just briefly. Did you grow up with piles of cash, lots of wealth?
No, Tony, I grew up in a sort of a middle-class neighborhood, but we were the odd ones out financially. And over the various books, if you've been tracking them, you'll have picked up my various embarrassing stories. I don't even pretend to have grown up in abject poverty, but we went through some very bad phases. And one of the worst ones, I was about 12, 13 years old, and my younger sister, little Art Lomicki, had just been born at the time. And, I can remember times when the church was feeding us. And then, of course, there are the funnier, more embarrassing ones about like the sort of old cars breaking down in front of the school, and the blazers that, start off down there and end up here because you can't afford the new one, and so forth. But yes, I was very conscious of living among people who were not struggling, even as we were. And I think that's possibly the genesis of looking for these ideas and wondering and looking so deeply at the topic and asking questions like, why? How does this happen that people get caught in these bad scenarios, whereas other people are simply living in different universes? And that's why I'm interested in truth rather than kindly sounding politically correct ideas. And I try and share that as openly and as frankly as I possibly can. It's interesting as well that, again, just harkening back to the idea of the traits of the rich, it turns out that a great many of the world's first generation millionaires and billionaires and business owners are actually more motivated by carrots than by stick than carrot. So in other words, it's quite powerful to work away from something that hurt or embarrassed you. And I think that there's actually a great deal of hope in that, because when you look at genuine poverty, Tony, when we're talking to people who have gone through nights where you've cried yourself to sleep, you wonder where the next meal is coming from, the kind of poverty that is personal and that hurts, it is more powerful to work away from that than it is to work towards, say, the car, the phone, the sneakers, the home. That hurts a lot. And even the small things for someone like myself who grew up in only moderate levels of struggle, it's very personal, it's very real, and it's the sort of thing where you look at it and you go, I do not want that again. And the research bears out that it's actually extraordinarily powerful to work away from the things that hurt the most.
Sure, that's really interesting. As you say, you don't put up the picture of the mansion or
it's
the vehicle.
All very well to put up the pictures of the Merc and the yacht and so forth. It's more effective to think about what you don't want ever to happen again. I don't want my kids to go through this.
Yeah, or to your children, as you say.
Yeah.
And now, Doug, I know you drive a Jaguar, but are you loaded? And how specifically are you building your wealth? Maybe that's an unfair question, but how are you, building your wealth and for your son
Yeah.
Are you really practicing, what you preach, so to speak?
Yeah, very much so. And I tell you, the thing that we've been focusing on the most recently is actually the reduction of costs. I'm an unapologetic car nut, but I've learned some interesting tricks about having a really great car and spending less on it. The Jaguar that I'm driving right now, I love that thing. It's a 5-liter V8. It's their big one, the XJ. If you're a Top Gear fan, it's the one Clarkson raced God in. So it's just a absolutely wonderful car. However, it is not a brand new car. And it's in fact the cheapest car I've owned in the last 3. So with every new car I've bought, I've gone down in how much I'm paying. And because I'm not buying the one that came out last week, I've learned several interesting tricks about how much car you can have and how little you can spend on it. So even now with little Mikey, whose birthday was yesterday, day before yesterday, just turned 4. Our goal is that he becomes self-sufficient as early as possible. Now, later on, that will become a financial principle where he has to, say, do chores for a little bit of money or whatever the case might be. But our guiding principle is the point is not to raise a child. The point is to raise an adult. And that is a very, very different way of thinking about it. Now, tagging that into things like, this book on political correctness does more harm than good, and the new wealth one. There is research by guys like Jonathan Haidt, who is a neurologist, and people like him who point out we've switched in society. We've gone from this idea of raising strong people, mentally strong people, to the idea that being a victim is somehow virtuous and to be desired. And we create this scenario where the person who's getting the most sort of points today socially is the one who can prove the greatest victimhood. Now, both from a wealth perspective, from a moral perspective, and I think indeed from a psychological perspective, I think that is massively dangerous. Our goal in terms of wealth is not to pave the way for our child. In fact, it is actually to transmit the values and show him how to do it himself. As Thomas Sowell said, there's not much that's interesting in studying poverty. What's interesting is how it is generated. So we're not going to be hung up on what he does for a living, but we are going to insist that he does it to the best of his abilities and that he learns the principles underpinning that. And that's going to be our parenting style.
Excellent, Doug, and thanks for being vulnerable and sharing that with us.
Only a pleasure, Tony. And here I'll just take a break and have a sip of water.
So the book, the new book, is available. It's in the store. It's on the Exclusive Books website.
Yeah.
So thanks again to Exclusive Books. I can't believe almost an hour has flown past.
Yeah.
So I'm going to close with this last question, Doug. Who needs to read this book, Doug?
Oh, Tony, the temptation, of course, is always to say, well, everyone. But realistically, I think the person who most needs to read it is someone who is just beginning to build wealth. I'm scared by the stats in terms of how many of the youth believe in socialism. I'm terrified about what that does to the next generation. The youth in particular, you need to have answers. You need to be able to dispute these ideas. You need to see how much danger it holds for your generation, more so than the previous generation. And just, linking to what you just said there, the dedication here to the little man and to his beautiful mom. You're my heart, you're my soul. So the book itself is dedicated to the 4-year-old and to his beautiful mommy.
Awesome, Doug. Thanks once again, and thanks to all of those who tuned in, all of those who are perhaps listening to this as a recording. It's been a great chat. I wish we had longer, Doug. Thanks to Exclusive Books, and I'm hoping that people go out there. I've personally read the book, and there's a lot of insights. If you're starting your journey, if you're in the middle of your journey, or even if you're towards the end of your journey, quite frankly, there's something you can take from this book. So thanks again, Douglas.
Great stuff. Thank you so much, Tony.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.